2 a.m., June 9th, 1944. 3 days after the Allied landings in Normandy. In a darkened, nondescript safe house in London, a single radio transmitter crackled to life. Its antenna, carefully hidden, began broadcasting a coded message directly to the Abwehr, German military intelligence in Madrid. The message was frantic, desperate, and of the utmost urgency. It came from Arabelle, the code name for Germany's most trusted, most valuable, and most lethally effective secret agent in Great Britain. The agent reported, with feigned fury and despair, that the Allied invasion in Normandy was real, but it was nothing more than a brilliantly executed feint, a large-scale diversion designed to draw precious German reserves away from the true target. The real attack, he insisted, the main invasion, involving over 50 divisions, was still to come. It would be led by the fearsome and aggressive General George S. Patton, and it would strike at the Pas de Calais, the closest and most logical point between England and France. He pleaded with his German handlers to convince the High Command not to move the powerful 15th Army, with its veteran infantry and the elite panzer divisions held in reserve, away from Calais. To do so, he warned, would be to fall into Montgomery's cunning trap and guarantee the destruction of the Reich in the West. In Berlin, the message was decoded and rushed to the highest levels of the OKW, the German High Command. It landed on the desks of men like Field Marshal von Rundstedt and General Jodl, and it confirmed exactly what their own intelligence analysts, their own institutional biases, and Adolf Hitler himself already believed. The man they knew as Arabelle had never been wrong. His reports were a goldmine of impeccable detail, a constant stream of intelligence that had proven its worth time and again. And so, the panzers of the 1st SS and 116th Divisions stayed put. The 15th Army remained dug in around Calais, its soldiers staring out across the Channel, waiting for a ghost army that would never come. What Hitler didn't know, what the entire German High Command failed to grasp, was that their master spy, Arabelle, did not exist. He was a complete fabrication. The frantic messages were being sent not by a German patriot, but by a Spanish double agent named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed GARBO by the British. And he wasn't just one agent. He was an entire phantom network of 27 fictional sub-agents that he had built from scratch, a private army of ghosts. This is the story of how one of the most unlikely spies in history, a failed chicken farmer and provincial hotel manager from Barcelona, created this army of ghosts, earned the unwavering trust of the Third Reich, and in the most critical week of the Second World War, fooled Adolf Hitler himself. This is the spy who saved D-Day. The journey of the man who would become GARBO began not in the corridors of power in London or Berlin, but in the bloody, ideological furnace of the Spanish Civil War. Juan Pujol Garcia, born in Barcelona to a family that prized culture over politics, was not a soldier, a revolutionary, or a natural ideologue. He was an ordinary man, a manager of a one-star hotel and a struggling chicken farmer who found himself trapped in a national nightmare. When the war began, he was managing a poultry farm on the outskirts of Barcelona. The conflict, in its brutal totality, consumed his world. Conscripted into the Republican forces, the fiercely individualistic Pujol was immediately repulsed by the dogmatic, often violent communism that held sway. He was imprisoned for his bourgeois background and his refusal to parrot party slogans. Later in the war, he deserted and found himself conscripted again, this time into the Nationalist Army under Franco. There, he witnessed the cold, calculated cruelty of fascism. He was imprisoned by both sides, and he saw the very worst of what both extremes had to offer. This experience forged in him not a political conviction, but a profound, burning, and deeply personal hatred for the totalitarian ideologies of both fascism and communism. He saw them as two sides of the same tyrannical coin, monstrous systems that demanded the absolute sacrifice of individual dignity, conscience, and life for the sake of the state. When World War II erupted, an extension of the same ideological poison he had witnessed firsthand, his conscience would not let him remain neutral. Watching the newsreels of London being bombed during the Blitz, he decided he had to do something for the good of humanity. His plan was simple, as it was audacious. He would become a spy for the British and help them defeat the Nazis. In early 1941, he walked into the British Embassy in Madrid, a city teeming with spies and intrigue. The officials there saw an eccentric, excitable Spaniard with a grandiose, unworkable plan. They politely and then firmly showed him the door. The naval attaché he spoke to dismissed him out of hand. Undeterred, Pujol tried again, this time approaching an MI6 officer. He was rejected again. He tried a third time, pleading his case, but the British saw no use for a man with no intelligence background, no military connections, and no formal training. He was, in their eyes, a liability, a well-meaning but useless amateur.
A normal person would have given up. But Juan Pujol was not a normal person. He possessed a theatrical imagination, a flair for the dramatic, and an iron will. His logic was as unconventional as it was brilliant. If the British wouldn't accept him as a genuine ally, he would first make the Germans accept him as a fake one, forcing the British to take him seriously. He began to craft a new persona. With his wife's help, he created the character of a fanatical pro-Nazi Spanish government official, a man who burned with ideological fervor and could, thanks to a diplomatic passport, travel freely. He walked into the German embassy in Madrid and pitched his services to an Abwehr officer, a man named Gustav Knittel. He told the German that his position allowed him to travel to London, and that he was willing to build a spy network for the glory of the Reich. The Abwehr, whose networks in Britain had been systematically dismantled by MI5, was desperate for a new foothold. They took the bait. They gave him a crash course in secret writing, a bottle of invisible ink, a list of contacts, a supply of cash, and a new code name, Arabelle. His mission was simple: go to England and start reporting. There was just one problem. Pujol had no way of getting to England, so he did the next best thing. He moved to Lisbon, Portugal, a neutral city that served as the espionage capital of Europe, and pretended he was in London. From his small apartment, with his wife's Araceli laboring alongside him, he began to build his fictional intelligence empire. His sources were not classified documents or secret contacts. There were a blue guide to Great Britain, a collection of railway timetables, a tourist map of England, and newsreels he watched at the local cinema. From these mundane scraps of public information, Pujol, a man who spoke almost no English and had never set foot in Britain, began to weave a tapestry of lies so detailed and plausible that it mesmerized German intelligence. He invented his first phantom sub-agent, a talkative KLM pilot who supposedly flew him into an RAF base and then continued to provide him with information. From there, his network grew. He sent detailed reports on the movement of British naval convoys, calculating their departure from Liverpool by cross-referencing ship arrival notices in Portuguese newspapers and studying his naval reference books. His reports, written in formal Spanish, were mailed to a German contact point in Spain, who would then forward them to Berlin. They were a mix of brilliant deduction and comical errors. He famously reported that in Glasgow, the famously tough dock workers would do anything for a liter of wine, a mistake no one familiar with Britain would ever make. He submitted his travel expenses for a fictional trip from London to Liverpool, calculating the cost precisely from a railway schedule, but failing to realize he'd used the wrong year. But far from exposing him, these small human errors made his report seem more authentic to his German handlers. They believed they were getting raw, unfiltered intelligence from a zealous but amateur spy on the ground. By early 1942, British intelligence at Bletchley Park, through their ultra-code-breaking program, began intercepting and decoding the messages between Arabelle and Madrid. At first, they were alarmed. There was a highly active German spy in London, sending a remarkable volume of information. But as they looked closer, they noticed the reports, while plausible, contained strange inaccuracies and were often slightly out of date. They realized this spy wasn't real. Even more astonishingly, they realized he was actively harming the German war effort by reporting on events like the Allied torch landings in North Africa, hours or days too late for the Germans to act, but just in time to build his own credibility. MI5, the British counterintelligence service, operating the legendary double-cross system under Sir John Masterman, was stunned. Someone was doing their job for them, and doing it brilliantly. They knew they had to find this man. After a long search, they finally tracked him down in Lisbon, Portugal. In April 1942, Juan Pujol was brought to London and met his new case officer, a sharp, Spanish-speaking MI5 agent named Tommy Harris. Harris, a fluent artist and natural deceiver himself, immediately recognized Pujol's genius. Together, in a small office, they transformed Pujol's amateur one-man show into the most sophisticated counterintelligence operation of the war. The British gave Pujol a new code name, one that perfectly suited his theatrical talents, GARBO, after the famous actress Greta Garbo, because, as Harris put it, he was the best actor in the world. From that office, Pujol and Harris began to expand the Phantom Network. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They didn't just invent agents, they gave them lives, personalities, rivalries, and problems. There was Agent Juan, a Venezuelan student in Glasgow named Carlos, who reported on shipping. There was Agent 3, a cynical Greek waiter in Chislehurst named Dagobert, who could report on troop movements he overheard. There was Agent 4, a Gibraltarian Nafi waiter codenamed Fred in the town of Chuffnell, whose reports on troop movements were so effective the Germans requested he be given a bonus. There was Agent 5, a disaffected Welsh nationalist leading a group of fascist sympathizers he called the Brothers of the Aryan World Order. The network grew to 27 characters, a fictional cast of spies scattered across Britain. Pujol wrote their reports in his own hand, infusing each with a unique voice, sending them to Harris, who would then broadcast them to the Germans via radio. To make the network truly believable, they had to make it vulnerable. In one of the most brilliant moves of the operation, they decided that one of their best agents, Fred, had to die. They had him fall ill with a terminal disease, crafting a series of reports on his declining health. Finally, they produced a forged death certificate and planted a fabricated obituary for him in the local newspaper, which they sent to the Germans. His fictional widow was even awarded a pension of £340 from the German government. The Germans were completely fooled and deeply mourned the loss of one of their best men. The credibility of GARBO, the master agent who could run such a network and even manage the deaths of his own men, soared.
By 1943, GARBO was the undisputed jewel in the Abwehr's crown. His information was considered A1, the highest possible grade, and was circulated directly to the German High Command. He had become the primary conduit through which the Germans believed they understood the Allied war effort in Britain. And that was exactly where the Allies needed him to be. Because the greatest deception in military history was now being planned, Operation Overlord. The Allies knew that success depended on one thing above all else: surprise. They had to convince the Germans that the main invasion was coming not at Normandy, but at the Pas de Calais. To do this, they created an entire phantom army, the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. They built inflatable tanks and plywood aircraft, broadcast fake radio traffic, and placed their most famous general, George S. Patton, in command of this ghost army. But for the deception, codenamed Operation Fortitude, to work, the Germans had to believe the ghost army was real. They needed their most trusted agent in Britain to report on it. They needed GARBO. GARBO's network became the official mouthpiece of Operation Fortitude. His 27 agents began sending a flood of reports, over 500 radio messages in the run-up to D-Day, all pointing to a massive military buildup in southeastern England, opposite Calais. They reported on the movements of FUSAG's fictional divisions, described their shoulder patches, and even complained about the boisterous American GIs filling their local pubs. It was a symphony of deception, and the Germans believed every note. This brings us back to the dark room on June 9, 1944. The Normandy landings had happened. GARBO's frantic message on June 9th was the masterstroke. He told his German handlers he was disgusted that his previous warnings had been ignored. This feigned anger was so convincing that the Abwehr radioed back a groveling apology, stating, "Your last reports are of consequence. Their transmission to us is of the greatest importance. They promised his intelligence would now go directly to Hitler's desk." The deception worked better than anyone could have dreamed. Convinced by GARBO, Hitler refused to release the Panzer divisions and the 15th Army to counterattack the fragile Allied beachhead in Normandy. For weeks, Germany's most powerful reserves waited for a phantom invasion that would never arrive. Historians agree that this delay was perhaps the single most critical factor in the success of D-Day. Even after the invasion, GARBO's work continued. When the first V1 flying bombs began to fall on London, the British used GARBO to feed false accuracy reports back to the Germans. By convincing them their bombs were overshooting the city center and landing in the northern suburbs, GARBO's network tricked the Germans into correcting their aim, causing the deadly rockets to fall short into the less populated fields of Kent and Sussex, saving countless lives in London. On July 29, 1944, with the Allies breaking out of Normandy, the Germans' faith in GARBO remained unshaken. They awarded him the Iron Cross for his services to the Third Reich, personally authorized by Hitler. The citation praised his extraordinary services to Germany. 5 months later, his real employers, the British, made him a member of the Order of the British Empire. Juan Pujol Garcia became one of only a handful of people in history to be decorated by both sides in the Second World War. After the war, Pujol feared he would be hunted by surviving Nazis. MI5 helped him create one last fiction. They faked his death from malaria in Africa and gave him a new identity. He moved to Venezuela, opened a small gift shop, and lived in complete anonymity for nearly 40 years, his incredible story known only to a handful of intelligence officers. His own family believed he was dead. He was only rediscovered in 1984 by the British writer and Member of Parliament Nigel West, a man who refused to believe the official story. Pujol was brought back to London, where he had an emotional reunion with his old case officer, Tommy Harris, and was honored by Prince Philip at Buckingham Palace. Juan Pujol Garcia was not a super spy in the mold of fiction. He was an ordinary man armed with an extraordinary imagination and a profound belief in human dignity. He created an army of ghosts that held back an army of steel. He never fired a shot, but from a small, quiet room in London, armed with nothing more than a radio and his own ingenuity, he fought and won one of the most decisive battles of the war. He was the spy who fooled Hitler.